Tere hommikust ja tere tulemast Taastava põllumajanduse konverentsile. Kõigepealt räägin natuke, miks me seda konverentsi üldse korraldame. Et siin ministeeriumis loeme igapäevaselt erinevaid Euroopa poolt tulevaid algatusi, poliitikaid ja ka rohekokkulepet ja nägime, et seda terminit regenerative agriculture, eesti keeles siis taastav põllumajandus, mainitakse üha rohkem ja nähakse kui ühte kestliku suunavõtete kogumikku. Et mujal maailmas on see juba rohkem levinud ja praktiseeritakse mitmel pool, aga Eestis pole see veel väga vastukaja tekitanud. Ja seega tahtsime seda kõigile potentsiaalsetele huvilistele täna tutvustada, sellise kerge maitse suhu anda ja ka ise selles rohkem selgust saada. Ja mul on ülimalt hea meel, et tänasele konverentsile on registreerunud üle 430 inimese, kellest siis 33% on põllumajandustootjad, 13% teadlased, 12% poliitikakujundajad ja ametnikud ning 42% huvilistest on muudest valdkondadest. Soovin teile kõigile põnevat konverentsi. Ja kõigepealt, enne kui läheme edasi, et ta ütleb meile tervitussõnad maaeluminister Urmas Kruuse. Palun.
Aitäh, tere ilusat hommikut kõigile, head konverentsid osavõtjad, tere tulemast ka head külalised välismaalt, kes meil täna tegelikult osalevad. Ja tõepoolest, kui ma selle pealkirja peale mõtlesin, et tegemist on taastava põllumajandusega, siis tõsi on ju see, et viimastel aegadel me kuuleme hästi palju sellest, kui me räägime taaskasutusest, keskkonnahoiust, tulevikuvisioonist, rohepöördest ja paljudes on see tekitanud küsimusi, et kas tegemist on lihtsalt jutupunktidega või on tegemist ikkagi konkreetse ja väga olulise väljakutsega. Ma olen mitu korda rõhutanud seda, et inimkond oma sellises 150-aastases ajaloos on ressursid, mida on loodud looduse poolt miljoneid ja miljardid aastaid võtnud kasutusele väga metsiku intensiivsusega. Ja maa harimine on tegelikult üks osa selle ressursi kasutusest ja meile väga vajalik ressurss. Selle tõttu on ääretult oluline, et me pidevalt arutleksime ja vaataksime seda, et kas see igapäevane tegevus, mida me oma töös ellu viime, kasutab ka seda ressurssi väga jätkusuutlikult. Kindlasti on täna, ma pean siin silmas tänavust aastat, lähiaega, lähitulevikku, ettevõtete jaoks otsuste tegemisel üsna keeruline. Ja keeruline selle tõttu, et kas ja kuidas edasi. Ma olen veendunud selles, et meie põllumehed ja metsamehed oma olemuselt on selgelt hea peremehelikud, sellepärast, et kes teab seda vana tuntud ütlust, et mitu korda sul on võimalus põldu narrida, et üle ühe korra välja ei tule, et siis 9 korda saad vastu. See paneb paika ka selle mõtteviisi. Aga samas kindlasti selles meeletus ühiskondlikus diskussioonis võib ju parafraseerida ka taastava põllumajanduse näite vastandit ehk laastav põllumajandus. Ja see on öeldud ju tegelikult sellepärast, et mõista seda, et see diskussioon ühiskonnas on laiem ainult kui põllumajandus. Me räägime ju tegelikult nii keskkonnaekspertidest, loodushoidjatest ja nii edasi. Ja meil on oluline see, et me seda oskust ja teadmist suudaksime siis kriitiliselt ja hea peremehelikult kasutada. Selle tõttu ma väga loodan, et sellised konverentsid, kus on koos nii teadlased, ettevõtjad, ühiskonnategelased, aitavad tegelikult meil leida neid õigeid suundi ja vahel viimasel ajal kuuled ka seda, et see rohepööre ja kliimateemad on justkui väga suur katsumus. Ma isiklikult arvan seda, et kui ettevõtjad enda sees ja oma ettevõttes kõik väga täpselt läbi mõtlevad, siis nad mõistavad ja saavad aru, et see on tegelikult võimalus. Samas ärme unustame seda, et tegemist on kindlasti väljakutsega. Aga kui me mõtleme ühiskonna ootusi laiemalt, siis me peame tunnetama seda, et me peame selle koos ellu viima ja seda peab mõistma ka tegelikult tarbija. Ja see tegelikult tähendab seda, et kas tarbija nõudmised on piiritud või lähtuvalt sellest, mille üle me ka täna arutleme, võivad ka tarbija nõudmistel olla piirid selleks, et paremini seda nõndanimetatud eesmärki ellu viia. Nii et ma igal juhul isiklikult tahan teile soovida väga mõnusat konverentsipäeva, uusi teadmisi ja veel kord tuleb tõdeda seda, et kahju on see, et ei saa kokku päris füüsiliselt nii, nagu me aastaid oleme harjunud, et COVID kindlasti oma olemuselt on meie teatud töövorme muutnud, aga ma väga loodan seda, et see ei vähenda pikas perspektiivis meie soove olla kontaktsed ja tegelikult saada uusi teadmisi teineteiselt. Edukat konverentsipäeva teile. Aitäh!
Aitäh, Urmas Kruuse! Ja enne kui lähme edasi meie külaliste ja esinejate juurde, tahaksin anda teile lühikese ülevaate sarnastest terminitest, mis selle taastava põllumajanduse valdkonnaga seotud on. Et need võivad võib-olla tekitada sellist segadust, et mis nad siis täpsemalt tähendavad. Et kõigepealt selline termin nagu agroökoloogia, ehk inglise keeles agroecology, on nendest võib-olla kõige sellisem laiem termin, mis hõlmab endas praktikaid, tehnoloogiaid, meetodeid, mis aitavad kaasa jätkusuutlikule põllumajandusele ja toidusüsteemidele ning tõstavad toiduga kindlustatuse ja toiteväärtuse taset nii praegustele kui ka tulevastele põlvedele. Ja selle raames käsitletakse ka selliseid sotsiaalseid ja keskkonnaprobleeme, arvestades seejuures jätkusuutlikkuse põhimõtetega. Ja ühtlasi kutsutakse siis edendama ka säästvaid tootmis- ja tarbimisharjumusi. Ja Euroopa poolt on olemas ka selline horisondi agroökoloogia projekt, et sellest kuuleme võib-olla varsti lähemalt. Siis taastavast põllumajandusest, et kuigi me sellest kuuleme täna palju, aga ma võib-olla lühidalt ütlen ära, et see on inglise keeles termin regenerative agriculture, mis siis hõlmab endas sellist terviklikku süsteemi maaharimisviisidest, mis keskenduvad eelkõige mulla tervise edendamisele, et tagada kestlik tulevik. Aga mõned olulised praktikad selles taastavas põllumajanduses on näiteks mullaviljakuse tõstmine läbi erinevate viiside, mulla taimkattel hoidmine, maa harimise vähendamine, loomade lisamine süsteemi ja ka mitmekesisuse loomine. Et see ei ole küll selline ametlikult defineeritud termin ja keegi otseselt ei tule seda kontrollima, et kuidas seda rakendatakse, aga üksikute taastava põllumajanduse praktikate rakendamine ei anna veel tegelikult õigust öelda, et tehakse taastavat põllumajandust. Et selleks tuleks ikkagi vaadata kogu ettevõtet tervikuna ja koostada plaan, et kuidas siis selles suunas liikuda. Ja hea on selleks kaasata ka siis konsulentide abi, et kas või välismaiste konsulentide abi, et täna siin paar inimest sellist esinevad ka. Ja Euroopas taastavale põllumajandusele veel kindlat märki ei ole välja kujunenud, aga USA-s on juba 2018. aastast pilootmärgina kasutusel regenerative organic certification, selline märk, mis siis tõlgituna oleks taastav mahepõllumajandus. Ja kui nüüd järgmise termini juurde minna, mis ongi mahepõllumajandus ehk organic farming, siis see on selline võib-olla eestlastele juba tuntum sõna ja see on tunnustatud kvaliteedimärk, loodushoidlik tootmisviis, ka selline praktikate kogum, mida siis kontrollitakse ja kus tuleb järgida Euroopa Liidu poolt mahemäärusega paika pandud printsiipe. Ja mõnest terminist veel, et täna tuleb sellest ka veidi rohkem juttu, on agrometsandus, mis on siis teadlik puude integreerimine põllumajandusse. Ja täna, kui sellest juttu tehakse, näidatakse pilti, nii et võib-olla siis saate sellest parema ettekujutuse, et kuidas neid puid siis ikka sinna põldude vahele panna. Ja veel üks termin, mida ilmselt täna kuuleme, on permakultuur. Inglise keeles siis permaculture, mis on selline disainisüsteem, mis on mõeldud inimasustuse ja põllumajandamise kavandamiseks. Ta jäljendab looduses levivaid mustreid ning selle eesmärgiks on luua stabiilne ja tootlik süsteem, mis kataks nii inimese kui looduse vajadusi. Ja siin all on samuti erinevaid praktikaid, mida teatakse ja kasutatakse, aga põhirõhk on siis need praktikad omavahel läbi selle disaini oskuslikult tööle panna. On olemas ka veel mitmeid teisi termineid, mida me täna otseselt ei käsitle, aga mis võivad hõlmata sarnaseid praktikaid. Lihtsalt nimetan need ära, et juhuks kui kuulete, et siis teate otsida. Et näiteks süsiniku põllumajandus, carbon farming ja conservation agriculture, millel siis otsest eestikeelset vastet ei oskagi kohe öelda, aga jah, et neid sarnaseid termineid sarnaste praktikate kohta on kindlasti veel. Et nii palju siis selliseks sissejuhatuseks ja natukene terminitest. Veidi aga nüüd korralduslikust poolest, et ma loodan, et kõik on jõudnud sinna YouTube'i lingile ja registreerinutele on saadetud ka Padleti link, ehk siis mille kaudu saate küsimusi esitada. Ja siis ettekande jooksul pange oma küsimused sinna kirja ja teised, kui teile tundub, et teie küsimus on juba seal küsitud, siis pange sinna tärnikesed alla, et teile see küsimus meeldib ja siis proovime neid küsimusi küsida, mida kõige rohkem on meeldivaks märgitud. Ja selleks, et seda küsimust küsida, siis vajutage sellele paremal all nurgas asuvale plussmärgile, kus pealt saate siis oma küsimuse esitada. Ja palun märkige siis sinna päisesse selle esineja nimi, kellelt soovite küsimust küsida ja alla ka oma nimi, et siis teame, kes selle küsimuse küsis. Nii, aga kuna päevakava on tihe, et siis liigume vast edasi esinejate juurde. Ja esimesena tuleb meile taastava põllumajanduse teemat avama ja tutvustama põllumajanduskonsulent Inglismaalt, kes on ise põllumajandusega tegelenud juba üle 20 aasta ja taastava põllumajanduse teemadega rohkem kursis kuskil 10 aastat. Ja Ben juba mõnda aega nõustab ka mõnda Eesti ettevõtet ja sellest kuuleme ehk hiljem lähemalt. Et Beni ettekanne on meil ette salvestatud, et saame subtiitrid alla panna, et kõik saavad aru, millest ta räägib ja pärast võtame siis ta laivis ühendusse ja saame ta käest küsimusi küsida. Nii, aga palun.
Hi, I'm here to talk about profitable farming for the future, looking at resilience of agricultural systems and how we can profit through diversity. As you can probably see, I have actually translated my own English writing into Estonian, which I think will probably end up slipping me up on slides, as I probably can't remember exactly what I wrote. So please bear with me, and I will take you on a journey. So better just explain a little bit about myself. Obviously, I'm from the UK. I'm a regenerative farmer in the UK, and also a regenerative agricultural advisor. And I spend quite a lot of time on the road in the UK, and now through Europe, Estonia and Portugal, France and Spain, giving regenerative advice on how to make farming systems more profitable, more sustainable, and more environmentally friendly. I've been practicing this on my own farm for nearly 20 years now, and got probably more in depth in the last 5, but been very, very interested in the environment for an awful long time. And I thought it was, I was being asked what I was doing and how I was doing it, which set me on the journey of becoming an advisor. Many of you might be thinking, what use is somebody from the UK doing, talking to us in Estonia about what he's doing, and how relevant is it to me as a farmer in Estonia. And I'll basically answer that question quite simply in that Mother Nature on 99% of the planet actually grows plants, has soil biology, has sunshine, has rainfall. So in actual fact, if you break down the fundamentals, we're very much, albeit slightly different ratios, we're very much similar across the whole globe. One important thing in regenerative farming is going back to basics and understanding that in actual fact, we farm three free things. That would be precipitation, sunshine or energy, and carbon dioxide. As farmers, we take these three free things and we put it through our own catalyst. And for farmers, of course, this is soil. And after we put that energy and the precipitation of CO2 through our soil, we create food, of which we call, of course, we sell and make profit. And anybody else bolting on various things to sell to you on this model, we have to be very wary of people removing money, cash, and all kinds of things from our own profitability. I mentioned that the soil and precipitation was very important. Of course, here I'm showing as farmers, we're not that great at holding on to certainly rainfall because our soils lack the absorption these days. And so the rainfall in actual fact carries our catalyst away, the very thing we actually own, the very thing that is our actual asset, which is worrying. The other thing we're really, really poor at is harvesting the sun's energy, because during the time of some of the peak energy of the solar radiation reaching us in Europe, July, August, and September, we generally have harvest going on. We have stubbles, we have all sorts of things, but generally not a huge amount of living roots or solar panels, of which we use as leaves to absorb all of this energy. So a lot of the energy coming to the earth at that time of year is well and truly wasted. So I'm going to talk a lot about my own farm because I think it's quite crucial that as an advisor, I also practice what I preach. And I'm going to show you a series of photographs of what regenerative practices mean and where I was as a farm about 10 years ago on an awful lot of things, and then I'll explain how and where we are. So one of the first things about regenerative agriculture, one of the first rules is limited disturbance. And as you can see in the background, there's not a huge amount of limit on this cultivation. There's a lot of dust flying, there's a lot of power being used, and there's an awful lot of cultivation going on. Another thing about limiting disturbance is the amount of chemicals we actually apply to the soil. Chemical disturbance is rather very aggressive. And when we talk about soil disturbance, a lot of people get confused and only think of things like no tillage, where in actual fact, disturbance can be caused by pesticides that we use all the time, of course, tillage, and of course, fertilizer, because fertilizer and ammonium nitrate was developed by the Haber-Bosch process pre-First World War to help feed the world. But of course, we also know it creates bombs. And these large bombs from ammonium nitrate create some huge holes in the ground when they're dropped from an aeroplane. We spread them out of the back of a fertilizer spreader. And whilst the damage is not as big as a huge bomb, the damage is large enough on a very small scale to create all sorts of soil disturbance and soil damage. So we have to be very aware that soil disturbance covers three things. The other thing, we call it in the UK armour. I think we called it cover here. I'm not sure you have a word for armor in Estonia. But by covering the soil, Mother Nature, and we should be well aware of this, will go out of her way to always put soil cover. We generally call them weeds. She even covers concrete where she can, and all kinds of things on roads and verges and things. So it's a very natural process that soil covering is something that protects the very thing, as we talked about, soil. It protects it from erosion. And as you can see here, it's fairly horrific when it becomes wrong and there is no cover. Cover as well here, lack of cover, shall I say, causes huge amounts of cracking, poor soil structure, and poor soil life. And in actual fact, you can tell this soil is rather pretty ugly in terms of soil health. So by covering it, prevents an awful lot of cracking too. Here's another picture of my farm that I've took like 2 years ago, 4 years ago perhaps. But it's rather quite important to understand that shifting baselines of soil erosion is something that we often don't notice. But interestingly enough, that hedge line up here was the farm height, or the field height, when we took it, when we started farming here in 1974. By 1997, I put in a 4-meter grass margin, as you can see. The soil had already dropped about 2 meters. Then in 1997, we put that grass margin in. In 2014, I put in an extra 2 meters of margin. And as you can see, in that very short period of time, 17 years, the soil has yet dropped another 60, 70 centimeters of erosion. And even between 2014 and 2017, when the photo was taken, we dropped another, it was about 15 centimeters. So it's rather quite drastic to see how erosion can occur and what living roots can do to hold the soil together to prevent it occurring. The third point of regenerative agriculture is that of diversity. And diversity is something nature always aspires to, putting in an agricultural system or any ecosystem. Picture here is our sprayer back in the day going over a 30-hectare field with absolutely zero diversity. And you wonder, and many people wonder why we end up with such terrible disease, pests and weeds, because nature, by its very nature, strives to put diversity into ecosystems, and here we are monocropping. So it's a real problem. And of course, when you don't put any diversity into the system, as I said here, this is actually a field of winter wheat, but you can see far more, and this is a UK problem, which is possibly coming up to Estonia at the moment, is what we call blackgrass. And when you end up using monocultures and no diversity, you can often end up with a non-diverse weed spectrum that then becomes resistant to pesticides and herbicides and creates massive problems of competition here. So this is a very good example of nature trying to correct the balance, which is a monocrop of winter wheat. And this is a photograph of obviously a sheep, and the farmer happened to say, "Oh, you know, stupid sheep got its head stuck in the fence as always." And I said, "Well, if you look at the grass that the poor sheep is actually trying to graze, it's A, too short, but B, totally lacking in diversity. And what the sheep here is doing is actually trying to get to the hedge and trying to get to other plants to try and balance its diet naturally. So this is nothing strange, but diversity in an animal's diet, much like our own diet, is very, very important. It wouldn't be very nice to eat kale, for instance, every single day of the week for every single meal. Number 4 of regenerative agriculture is living root. This isn't my farm, funny enough. This is a photograph I took in Australia, but I thought it highlighted extremely well what living roots can do to soil and prevent soil erosion. And that single plant seems to have kept that bit of soil together wonderfully well. Was a prime example of actually keeping soil from erosion. Tragically, this is a photograph of our own farm. Again, about 7-8 years ago, we used to allow a sheep farmer to come and graze stubble turnips and cover crops, but mainly stubble turnips at the time. And as far as the sheep farmer was concerned, he wanted as much out of the ground as he possibly could, so made sure there were absolutely no stubble turnips left on the ground whatsoever. And by doing that, of course, he made a terrible mess of our soil. As you can see, it's a real problem with absolutely no living roots in this soil at all. And the fifth one, and it's one of the trickier ones when I talk to a lot of farmers starting out on this journey of regenerative ag, is that of the integrated of animals, or integration of animals. And I think what's really important here is, in the UK, but I think this is pretty much worldwide these days, there are pretty much livestock farmers that specialize in livestock, and there are arable farmers specializing in arable. The two very rarely meet anymore. Mixed farms is something that's getting less and less. And livestock terribly are put in barns and fed because it's easy. It's rather ridiculous that these animals were born with 4 legs, and it seems strange that you burn all carbon dioxide, growing, harvesting, spraying, everything, hauling, storing all of the food and bringing it to the animal, when in actual fact we could turn around and take the animal to the food. The other really important thing about animals in housing is that Mother Nature very cleverly designed the fact that urine and feces should never mix. They are put in different parts of the body on males, and in females, they are given totally different trajectories. This means that they do not mix on the soil, and it allows all the greater utilization of both into the soil. When you put them in the livestock barn, they mix and form a slurry. And slurry, of course, creates huge ammonia emissions. And nature is very good at preventing losses and leaks out of a system. We, of course, put them in slurry lagoons and see this huge amount of ammonia released off these slurry lagoons, and having to start thinking about how we reduce this. Well, you reduce it by taking the animal to the field, of course. This is a picture of some cows in some barns. Obviously, pigs indoors yet again, in an indoor pig rearing system. And the monoculture of sheep, just grazing grass, of no diversity, and pretty much grazing it down as far as they possibly can before moving them on. A lot of people, when I talk about the move to regenerative agriculture, is often how much is it all going to cost? I need a new drill, I needed this, I need that, and I need an awful lot of things. And I think one of the most important things, hopefully, that I can give across on this webinar is the fact that these are the 3 most important things you'll ever invest in: a spade, a trowel, and a tape measure. In actual fact, most people would that head on this journey go and buy a very expensive drill and wonder why after about 2 to 3 years their soils and certainly their yields are massively dropping. There's a reason for that, because you've become over time a huge mechanical, or your soil has become a huge mechanical junkie. It's relied on this mechanical tillage, and one day you decided to wake up and not do any tillage. But your soil and your soil functionality and your soil biology, of course, has got no chance of actually putting as much biology in as it possibly can to support the growth of crops. So we use a spade an awful lot to actually decide what the state of the soil is in, what intervention, cultivation, if any, we need to do, and how best to do it, and start doing things like worm counts, as you can see on the right-hand side. I think there was 36 worms in that one spadeful of soil, because it's really important to have these worms. Worms, of course, have the golden worm ratio of 2, 5, 7, 11. And there's some numbers you should really remember. There's 2 times more humus that comes out of a worm that goes in. 5, there's 5 times more plant available phosphate that goes that comes out of a worm that goes in. 7, there's 7 times more nitrogen that comes out of a worm than goes in. And 11 is potassium. There's 11 times more potassium that comes out of a worm than goes in. So you can imagine the more worms you have, the more fertilizer or the more free fertilizer you have in order to feed your crops. So this is why soil health is such an important thing. Building up soils, building up soil resilience, but first and foremost is taking that spade and starting to understand how your soil functions. Dig lots of holes, look for compaction layers, look for structure, soil structure, and that sort of thing. One day I rather hope to come to Estonia and actually do a workshop to show how to use a spade and what to look for. I think a lot of people are more than happy to invest in a spade, but actually, are they confident in identifying compaction? Are they confident in identifying bad soil structure and all those sort of things? And when you do, what decisions you need to make to overcome them? So, be something. So, what are we doing? Back through the things we're doing and doing it terribly wrong. First and foremost, limited disturbance. So whereas my father especially and my grandfather would have ploughed and then worked the ground to create a seedbed and spent a huge amount of time, energy, and effort in seedbeds, we now do direct drilling. This is part of the transition as well, depending on what drill you have, is also dependent on how much disturbance you do. This is a Claydon drill. I put this photograph in because this is a subsoiler. If we identify compaction, it's really important out, but it's really important that we take it out in such a way that in actual fact that we don't do any soil surface damage. We only are looking to take compaction out of the deep layer or the layer that it's at. So this is what I expect soils to look like after they've been subsoiled. We do not expect them to be boiled up and mixed and end up with a brown soil surface. Here's an interesting one. It's compost. And compost is something that's really important. And we use compost and compost extracts. And this especially is a compost extract. I'm sure you've probably heard, and if you haven't, it's well worth Googling the Johnson Sioux bioreactor. This is one of my own. And I use this to create some soil biology. It's something I'll touch on briefly now, and perhaps one day we can have another chat about exactly how and why and what we do with soil biology. But this is something, when we do the subsoiling, we generally take an extract of this. So we take some of this that's absolutely full of soil life. We dissolve it in water, and then we inject the water down behind the subsoiler legs. So we're actually creating more biology into the soil. And we talk about limited disturbance, and this is an inter-row hoe, hoeing between wheat. It's only literally scratching the surface. It is far better than the huge amount of herbicide we're having to use on some of our most resistant weeds, and even then they're ineffective. So in actual fact, we're causing more damage to the environment than we are damage to the weed itself. So things like the inter-row hoe and that sort of thing become really, really critical. And this is something I'm a big fan of. Armor, soil armor, or as we call it, cover, soil cover. And quite rightly, This is a cover crop. We talked about diversity as well, and I'll come to diversity in a bit. But as you can imagine, with a cover crop, you put as much diversity as you can, and you make sure you have at least 5 groups of plants. So we have in here grasses, cereals, legumes, quinopods, and brassicas. And the 5 are very, very important at actually making your soil phenol compounds come alive. It actually, for a good of any 4 of those species, but when you add the 5th, it makes a massive, tremendous difference in the soil. So this is something that's really important whenever we haven't got a crop in the ground or between crops or anything. We always look to make sure that we arm and cover the soil. Of course, this is not always possible. So one thing we do, and I'm not sure how available compost is in Estonia, but this is municipal compost from the local council. And the top picture shows a field that's spread onto winter wheat of compost that actually, of course, protects the soil surface itself. And where you can't actually have cover like you wanted to, compost is a very, very useful way of armoring or covering your soil. One other thing we do here in the UK, and doing more, we've been doing it for 6-7 years now, is understories of clover. And this is a narrow leaf white clover. And this is obviously, you can imagine, useful for many reasons. Almost it armors the soil or covers the soil. Number 2, it's a nitrogen fixating plant, so it provides nitrogen to my wheat. Number 3, Mother Nature always looks to keep putting, covering the soil. So if you're covering it with your own plant, the chances of you ending up with lots of weeds is very limited. So it covers an awful lot of bases of regenerative agriculture and keeping that soil covered. Number 3, diversity. This was taken from our sprayer tractor on a trial that we did initially 3 years ago now. As you can see, there's a very distinct line on the right-hand side compared to the left-hand side. It's a field of winter wheat. It's a monoculture of winter wheat. So what's the difference? Is it variety? You could say it's variety, yes. But in actual fact, so on the left, that's all yellow rust. It's a nasty fungal pathogen. On the right-hand side, and as you can imagine, got huge yellow rust pressure when you've got that all covered in yellow on. Well, the yellow part of the winter wheat is a single variety. Believe it or not, it actually has quite good resistance to yellow rust, but with a monoculture of a monocrop of essentially a whole heap of clones, you can imagine if yellow rust manages to get through one part of the plant defense, the whole field, farm, and country essentially becomes very susceptible. On the right-hand side, we have taken a mixture of 212 varieties of winter wheat, mixed them all together, planted them, and as you can imagine, it's extremely hard for yellow rust to break down all 212 varieties of winter wheat and create huge problems. So diversity there is absolutely essential as part of my winter wheat campaign. Diversity in livestock. I have a thing in the UK, we call it a flerd. And a flerd is the combination of 2 words, a flock of sheep and goats and a herd of cows. And it always occurred to me strange that people keep fields of cows and fields of sheep separate. And of course, what I do is make sure we have diversity. So in actual fact, in our herbal lays, we often have cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and alpacas, often with chickens too. So we make sure we've got diversity, and we move them very regular through mob grazing techniques, which prevents an awful lot of fly problems. It prevents worm problems and all sorts of things and the health of our animals. I'm sure you can see there, it looks rather quite good. Very, very rarely, and I say rarely, I don't think my cows have ever had an antibiotic in 3 years, no wormite and no fly spray. So there's something we must be doing that's going quite right, and it's not costing me a lot of money to keep them either. One other thing on diversity that's really important is the consideration of things like agroforestry. Why wouldn't you have some trees integrated in your cropping program? And here you can see the potato rows in between alleys of trees. And tree alleys give you some fantastic income because of the high value of what trees can give you. And here we have potatoes in between. This isn't actually on my farm. We've only just planted 50 hectares of alley crops, of alley trees, should I say. So we're very, very early doors into our program, but we've got fruits, fruit trees, nut trees. We have biomass trees, and we've also planted some trees to see if we can't generate some truffles. Time will only tell on that, but it's quite interesting and quite exciting to see what might happen there for us. So number 4, living roots. This is the clover field after that winter wheat. So the winter wheat was harvested in July, and of course the clover that was in the bottom of that crop then actually took the sun energy, as I said, because we don't generally use it in July, August and September, and converted that into quite a large crop of clover. We mowed the clover and eventually baled it, and obviously if we ever need to feed our animals through the winter because of too wet or things, we've created huge amounts of clover hay. The other thing, of course, it means that this ground is permanently covered because the clover will keep regrowing year on year on year. And like I said, we're about 7 years in on our clover, and just keep direct drilling different crops into it each year on a standard rotation. And of course, the crops happen to be full of different varieties for diversity. This is another thing about keeping living roots. Here you can see that we mow in between. We essentially mow every 12 meters to allow living roots to be at different stages. And of course, also our beneficial insects would be rather disappointed if we mowed it all at the same time and they had nothing. All of a sudden, they've gone from absolute feast to absolute famine. So we manage our cover crops in such a way that it's really important, if you can mow your cover crops down to a height of about 15 centimeters, it stimulates huge root growth and obviously feeds far more soil biology. So one thing we do quite often is every so often is go out and mow, like I said, every 6 to 12 meters in strips, and then 2 weeks later do the opposite as the other flowers come back. So it's something that's really important as part of our soil building program. And this is an interesting picture that I use an awful lot. In the background is our winter wheat of all those 212 varieties. But in the foreground, this is a field that is down by the river and floods. And there's not a lot we can do about flooding in the short term. Of course, in the long term, we're trying to store more water in our soils to prevent water reaching the river as fast as it is, and it becomes really problematic. But what we're doing in the short term, so what happens is the flood water comes on and in various places becomes puddles and stays there. And of course, what we make sure we do is plant some cover into these places in the spring when the water is gone, to make sure we keep those living roots going in the plant. If we want our soils to respond and keep going, they need living roots, and the exudates, which is like a sugary carbon carbohydrate, amongst other elements that feeds soil biology. Here we go with the integration of livestock. As you can see, here's my flood. Part of the flood anyway, small part. So the cows and the sheep in together. And you can see, and I thought I'd just mention quickly about my free choice minerals, which is on the back of the trolley there that has the water on the front and that box on the back. And I'll just explain what that box is, and I won't. There is a slide coming up about that box, so I thought it was then, but it's not. Here's our goats, and the really important thing of goats, we have a quite a nasty problem with willow encroaching in a lot of our fields down by the river. So we actually take a waste product that we would have normally got chainsaws and big excavated diggers to dig these out of the ponds and various things we have. But these days we allow this we cut them down and allow the goats to feast, and we can manage to finish goats up and produce meat as a byproduct of a tree that becomes a problem. So it's rather quite useful. We also have pigs out on pasture as well. I find them far more flavoursome and far more enjoyable to watch pigs running around green spaces than in barns on slatted floors or puddling around in mud all winter because they've been mismanaged. Another important part of livestock is our chickens, and we have herbal lay-fed free-range chickens in our chicken tractor for laying eggs that we sell in our farm shop. And of course, we've got all these flowers around that I've created. So here's my wife and daughter checking on one of our 15 beehives that we have now, producing honey, which again we sell in our local farm shop. Reducing variable animal costs. I don't know why that's, hang on, ignore that, sorry, here. I didn't realize that was part of it. I was talking about my free choice minerals, and I think it's probably worth me just talking for a moment about it for those that are thinking or have animals, and how important these are. Animals are incredibly clever, first and foremost, and they are very much in tune with their dietary needs. Something I learned, it all started from reading about cows and sheep following the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine when the nuclear power plant blew up, and there was a lot of fallout of Chernobyl over the Shetland Isles up in the north coast of Scotland. And those animals that weren't actually housed or weren't actually contained within fields made their way automatically to the foreshore and began eating seaweed and kelp. And of course, it's probably the only known thing, which is iodine as a cure for radiation poisoning. So that was quite interesting to read about that. And another thing occurred to me when I was treating my sheep for foot rot about 2.5 years ago. They had problems with their feet, and I was standing them in a bath of copper, 15 minutes each little batch, that it took me 3/4 of the day to treat. And I started to think, well, if copper is so important at treating the disease from the outside, what would happen if they had a bit of copper on the inside of the animal? I spoke to a vet and he said, well, copper's poisonous to sheep, so for goodness sake, don't feed it. I thought that was rather a ridiculous statement, to be honest, and ignored him anyway. And what I did, I created this mineral bar after doing a fair bit of reading. This is not unique to me, certainly, and it's been done in New Zealand quite a lot. And here I have what we call free choice minerals. The animal can come, and if it's deficient in sulfur, salt, it feels like it needs apple cider vinegar, cod liver oil, seaweed, copper, dolomitic limestone, or ground limestone. It comes and helps itself. Interesting enough, we haven't had a foot rot problem since we started offering free choice copper to our animals. And more interestingly, as we tow this around the farm, depending on different fields, the animals will actually take different amounts of nutrients. Interesting enough, we've got one field where they really go at the sulfur. The rest of the farm, they never touch it. And it's quite remarkable to see which elements, if any, they become more interested in. Not only the integration of livestock for our own monetary value, but I think it's really important to look at livestock integration from the wildlife point of view, because in actual fact, with everything we're doing on the farm, all of a sudden we're seeing all kinds of wildlife come back to our farm. And this livestock is absolutely essential to everything that we do, with butterflies, birds, snakes, and bees, and small mammals, large mammals, and all that sort of thing that's returning to the farm. And we're seeing things that we haven't seen in 45 years of farming, returning to a habitat that we're creating as a byproduct of being a profitable farm. And here's something that one of the first things we did was there were EU grants at the time, and there still are EU grants, more to the point, for hedge planting. We planted 12 kilometers of hedges on the farm, which is something that was quite a daunting project when we undertook it. But as you can see, our farm was rather a barren, open landscape at the time. And 20 years later, not only the hedges, they've been laid now. I don't know whether you do hedge laying in Ukraine, not Ukraine, in Estonia, sorry. But these hedges have grown up and then they've been laid over. So they now perform a livestock barrier as well, allowed to regrow. And as you can imagine, this is essential for keeping livestock in fields. But you can imagine the habitat we have created for birds, butterflies, all sorts of things living in these hedgerows. So I've now got a living barrier that I don't have to maintain too much, and the environment is more than happy to be part of that. One of the things for me, and I've been quite straight-faced, because I do struggle a little bit with Zoom, because I can't see people's reactions and smiles or frowns or that sort of thing. But one thing I think is really essential for regenerative agriculture is to put the fun back into farming, put the enjoyment. There is far too much hassle, stress, worry, and all of that that really shouldn't be happening. We should really enjoy our farms and have some really good fun. And here we are, my son, my wife, my daughters, friends, and all that sort of thing, all get involved with us on the farm, and we have, shall I say, some really good fun days. Some days are not brilliant, but never too bad. We always think that we are blessed, we are lucky, we are making a very nice profit each and every year, and every year that we tread and do more. And again, it's probably another conversation about all our enterprises on the farm, which we've now developed into nearly 20 enterprises off our single farm, all bringing in very nice incomes, because one drives another, which drives another, which drives another. And we're absolutely thrilled with what we're doing. And it's like a snowball effect. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get more and more infused. And as you can see, it's brilliant. And I very much thank you for your time. Please feel free to get in touch with me at any time, and we can catch up and have a chat about it. Thank you very much.
Ja suur aitäh Ben-ile ja vaatame kohe, kas me saame taga meile ühendusse laivi. Aga enne tahaksin selgitada ühte olulist tähelepanekut või viga, mis me siin tõlkes märkasime, et iga asi on millekski hea, et saame seda siis kohe nii-öelda selgeks rääkida. Et nagu nägite, siis ettekandja kasutas sõna soil, aga mis tõlkes oli siis tõlgitud kord mullaks, kord pinnaseks. Aga oluline on tähelepanu pöörata just sellele, et me tõlgiksime sõna soil mullaks. Et see on konkreetselt defineeritud ja sellel on kindel sisu. Et mulla all me mõtleme siis mulda koos kõigi tema horisontidega ja selles on elu. Et muld ei ole ainult see pealmine pinnase kiht. Ja sellele tuleks siis kindlasti rohkem tähelepanu pöörata, et mitte kasutada seda umbmäärast sõna pinnas. Ja peame seda probleemi hakkama siis koos lahendama, sest kahjuks on see ka levinud nii-öelda avalikel veebilehtedel ja isegi õigusaktides seda mainitakse kui pinnast, mis tihti peaks olema soil. Et näiteks pinnase saastumine, mis tegelikult on väga sageli hoopis mulla saastumine. Et julgustame teid siis seda ka ise rohkem märkama ja sellele tähelepanu pöörama ja kasutama sõna muld ja siis tegema korrektuure, kui vaja. Ja Ben on meil ka siis otse eetris. Hello, Ben.
Hello.
So we heard a nice presentation from you, and we have lots of questions coming in. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
So I'll just start reading them out so you can comment or answer them. So Simon is saying that we should never use a shovel that cuts worms into half. Real worm counters use a fork.
Okay. I think anything that you put in the ground is more useful by hand than not using anything at all. The idea of using a spade or a shovel is to actually look at the face that's left when you actually dig a hole, and that way you can actually look at the compaction zones, you can look at the zones of your soil. When using a fork, you can often put in artificial amounts of structure, and it's very hard to identify problems if you use a fork rather than a spade or shovel.
Ma natukene tõlgin, et küsisin, et siin oli üks kommentaar, et tõelised vihmaussi loendajad peaksid kasutama hoopis harki, mitte labidat, ja Ben siis kommenteeris, et labidat kasutatakse eelkõige selleks, et näha seda lõiget, mis tekib sinna mulda, ja selle järgi saab siis vaadata, kui kompakteerunud see pinnas on, et kui kasutada seda harki, et siis võib tekkida seal nagu ebamäärasusi selle arusaamisel. Okay, thank you. So Taylor is asking you, what initiated the change in your farm? What was the ignition for moving to regenerative farming? If there is no understanding of how ecosystems work, then what needs to happen to farmer to move towards regenerative practices?
Okay, there's a huge amount of reasons why I changed, and it's hard to pin it down on one in particular. One of the greatest things for me, I guess, my father passed away, and I started looking through some of his farm records. And what we noticed in 1987, we grew the same yield that we did in 2014. The difference being the cost of growing things in 2014 was 6 times greater than what we were growing in 1987. So in actual fact, I realized I was on a treadmill of adding more and more and more products and spending more and more money and ending up with a very, very similar result. And it was time to start thinking about getting off this treadmill.
Okei, jah. Teele küsis, et kuidas ta sellele teele üldse sai, et taastava põllumajanduse poole liikuda. Ja Ben vastas, et tema jaoks oli üks oluline avastus, kui ta vaatas oma vanaisa neid vanu märkmeid ja leidis, et 87. aastal oli siis nende saagikus sama suur kui 2014. aastal, ainult et need kulud olid 6 korda suuremad ja see pani teda mõtlema, et kuidas siis saaks teistmoodi edasi. Okay, thank you. So, can you please explain the importance of 5 types of crops in cover crops? Why the 5th is essential and upon the 4th, and what's the 5th?
Sorry, was the question about why do I use diversity in cover crops?
Sorry, no, the five. What's the importance of 5 types of cover crops?
Biotypes, did you say?
Five types.
Oh, 5 types.
Yes.
Okay, so interesting enough, the 5 types of cover crop I use are that of grasses, legumes, brassica, cereal, and chenopod. And the reason I use those 5 types in any kind of order and in any type of mixture, depending on exactly what I'm trying to achieve, but the 5 types have been studied in depth by a Brazilian soil scientist called Ademir Caligari, who is a wonderful chap. Have a look at some of his YouTube channels and that sort of thing, and presentations. But their observations in Brazil were when you mix those 5 types of cover crop, you end up with an incredible amount of phenol compounds in the soil being released, and essentially they stimulate each root exudate of the different groups stimulates far more production of flavonoids, bioflavonoids, root exudates, and that sort of thing. So they actually enhance each other massively. Using any of the others is good, but when you mix the 5 together, you get more than the 5 individual parts. If you see what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. Et küsimus oli siis, et miks just 5 tüüpi neid vahekultuure peaks vähemalt kasutama. Ja siis Ben ütles, et kõik need erinevad tüübid tekitavad erinevaid neid fenoolseid ühendeid ja mis siis mõjuvad stimuleerivalt erinevatele nendele taimegruppidele, et siis nii-öelda kogu see süsteem muutub järjest võimsamaks. So can you explain a bit more how are these measures that you have taken financially supported by UK government and by EU before Brexit?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I'm not really much of a subsidy farmer. I don't really go after that many subsidies because the beauty for me with regenerative farming is I can compete with each and every other farmer because essentially whilst maintaining yields, my costs have been driven down and down and down. So essentially, my profit margin is going up, not down. There are more and more grants starting to become available through the EU and now through the UK for various things like no-till drills and various other things of measuring and helping people become more regenerative. And that's a fantastic thing. But for me, the financial implications of becoming regenerative actually become more and more profitable anyway in their own right. So it's not something to be afraid of in that you might lose profitability. My profitability has actually increased without the need for government subsidies. If the government decide to come and support regenerative farming, that's fantastic. And of course, I would take any grants that were freely available because why wouldn't I? That would also increase my profit. But it's not something you need to do because of government support. It's something you can do without the need for subsidies.
Thank you. Et küsimus oli siis, et milliseid toetusi ta on kasutanud ja Ben ütles, et ta ei ole väga palju toetusi kasutanud, et kui ta on sellel taastava põllumajanduse teel olnud, et siis ta nii-öelda kulud on pigem vähenenud ja ta on suutnud säilitada oma saagid, ehk siis tema tulusus on pigem kasvanud. Ja ta arvabki, et taastava põllumajandusega pigem need tulud kasvavad ja otseselt vajadust nende toetuste järgi ei ole. So I think this is the last question. When you use cover crops and seed cereals to the field with direct drilling, have you ever experienced that cover crops dominate over other species and kill out the cereals? In nature, in natural selection, it's quite common process and might affect the harvest in agricultural productivity. What are your experience regarding that? Have you experienced natural selection on your fields?
Okay, so one thing that's quite important is to manage the cover crop. We manage them in a number of ways here in the UK. I guess the simplest way of managing a cover crop is the use of glyphosate. Obviously, glyphosate has its own issues with soil health and the wider use and operator exposure, and we know all the glyphosate issue. We can crimp cover crops, which roll them flat and actually bruise them enough to cause destruction. And of course, we can also graze them with animals that helps in the destruction of the cover crop. So essentially, what we do, we manage the cover crops in such a way that they start releasing all of the nutrients that are stored in that cover crop back to the plant, the cereal plant, or whatever you're trying to grow. So we're not trying to grow them in unison. However, we also grow understory cover crops in a few places where we actually put a perennial, very low-growing clover in the bottom of our wheat crops. And we manage those yet again. And the idea is you direct drill into the clover, and the clover has a symbiotic relationship with the wheat in that it gives the wheat nitrogen for obvious reasons. It increases soil health, it helps with drainage, it does all those sorts of things. But before we drill, we'll graze the clover. And yet again, there are certain management tools we can use to just knock the clover back enough. A small dose of a herbicide, for instance, will just hold it back far enough so that we don't make the clover compete with the wheat.
Okay, thank you. Et küsimus oli siis selle kohta, et kui kasutada seda meetodit, et vahekultuuride sisse otse külvata, et kuidas siis vältida seda, et vahekultuurid üle ei võtaks seda põhikultuuri. Ja Ben vastas, et on mitmeid võimalusi, kuidas seda vahekultuuri nagu majandada, et kindlasti üks levinumaid võimalusi, mida ka Inglismaal kasutatakse, on glüfosaadi kasutamine, aga sellega kaasnevad suured mulla elustiku ja mulla terviseprobleemid, aga tema kasutab ka selliseid teisi meetodeid, mis mõjuvad mullale paremini, et need on sellised, siis rullitakse need vahekultuurid maha, et siis see põhjustab piisavalt sellist taimede hävitamist, et siis see saab sinna otse sisse külvata ja nad ka karjatavad neid vahekultuure enne, kui need sinna sisse külvavad. Ja samuti kasutavad allakülve, ilmselt mingit madalat ristikut, millel on sümbioos ristikuga, et kui külvata otse ristikusse, siis ristik annab nisule seal palju lämmastikku ja aitab muid toitainet omastada ja vahest nad siis ka ennem seda ristikut karjatavad. Okay, thank you, Ben. I think we have to move on, but maybe afterwards, in the end of this block, we can have another common chat. We will see. So thank you for now.
No problem.
Ja edasi liigume siis juba Stefan Gerneti juurde, kes on kogenud aednik ja põllumajandusettevõttes töödejuhataja ja konsulent. Et tema missioon on tuua taastav põllumajandus Eestisse ja ta rajab talu, mis rakendab bioloogiliselt mitmekülgset, multifunktsionaalset ja integreeritud põlluharimissüsteemi, et toota ökoloogiliselt mõistlikku toitu, taastades samal ajal biosfääri ja koolitades uut põlvkonda taastava harimise praktikates. Et ta loodab teha ka koostööd Eesti juhtivate teadlaste ja põllumeestega, et mõõta nende praktikate ökoloogilist ja majanduslikku ja sotsiaalset mõju Eesti kontekstis. Stefan, palun.
My name is Stefan Gernet. I'm a farm management consultant and regenerative farmer. I have a degree in agribusiness management from the Australian College of Agriculture and Horticulture and many years of hands-on experience, well, in different types of farms. I'm passionate about regenerative agriculture, and I've worked on a number of farms in Australia, Germany, the UK, and now here in Estonia. I've worked on 1,000 head dairy operations in the outback, large-scale orchards in Germany to small-scale family farms in the UK. To describe my work, I would say that I help farmers to translate all of this information that is coming out about regenerative agriculture and look at it, what does it mean on their land in their specific context, and help them implement it in this way. But I'm also a farmer, an active farmer. I'm the operational manager at Olivier, which is Estonia's first regenerative farm, multi-layered regenerative farm. It's a farm between Tartu and Otepää. Our aim is to build a model farm for Estonian context, and also we're building it as an educational place where we want to teach farmers and farmers to be, so to speak, to learn some of these practices. Today I'm going to talk with you about the layering of enterprises and maybe a new idea, a new emerging field in agriculture. It's called agroecology. Agro referring to, well, agriculture, and ecology meaning exactly that, ecology, the study of nature. So agroecology is the mimicking of natural dynamics and patterns in ecosystems and the modeling of our farms and on those principles to use the natural energy, the force that makes nature happen, our ally in food production. This way we are working with nature instead of against it, using whatever it is however it is that nature works as the driver of our farm's health and fertility. So what is this force that makes nature happen? Well, I can't answer this question. I don't know what it is or why it happens, but I do know that it works in patterns and that we all can see these patterns. One of the fundamental patterns of how nature works is that, or reality works really, is that things either go better or they get worse. They get less complex or they get more complex. For example, and I'm obviously drastically simplifying, a forest gets more and more diverse over time. It moves from simple to complex. This is called succession. In fact, every ecosystem works like that. And I would argue life itself works like that too. Succession occurs all the time. We can observe the dynamics that make this happen, mimic them in ways that helps us with the production on our farms, and even accelerate them. And thereby boosting our land's fertility and resilience by not fighting against succession, but by working with it, riding the wave of succession, so to speak, using nature as the engine of our land's productivity. Everyone understands the basic succession. We are learning it in elementary school, but for some reason on our farms, we completely ignore it. Agroecology as a concept might or might not be new to you. It involves a paradigm shift from external input-based agriculture to a form of production that is cycling nutrients, water, and energy on our land. I want to plant this seed in your heads because I believe that it's the only way agriculture can move forward. Instead of domesticating nature, mastering it, and reducing nature to something that is simple, we should accept that it's complex. We should use this complexity as an asset, and we should diversify production by combining different plants with trees, with animals, in order to reconstitute at the field level the interactions between these different elements of nature. With this talk, I want to challenge all of you to think outside the box. Thinking of agroecology as the mimicking of the surrounding ecosystem, let's look at an ecosystem for a second. And again, I'm obviously I'm simplifying immensely here, but an ecosystem is made of a vast number of individual processes. While each process being its own thing, its own whole, for example, the trees in an ecosystem, or the trees in a forest, they are their own thing. They are the trees in the forest, or the wild boars that stump through it. They're connected in ways that are mutually dependent and beneficial for the whole ecosystem, in ways we're just beginning to understand. If there would be only trees in the forest, you would not call it a healthy ecosystem. We would miss many of the important processes and dynamics that make the forest healthy and resilient. You need all the shrubs and herbs and birds and deer, boars, wolves, all the things that make the ecosystem to complete the ecosystem. so it can thrive and look after itself. Like we don't need to fertilize a forest, right? The forest just grows, so to speak, and it's using all these interactions to make that happen. So in agroecology, depending on the climate and environment we're in, we look at the dominant ecosystem around us and try to mimic our farms on those natural models. We're trying to understand what the environment wants to be, so to speak. We don't start to plow a wetland and try to plant corn in it because the environment is clearly not suited. This way we can understand different ecosystems, and the human mind, together with modern and ancient insights, can understand the patterns of nature and even accelerate them, make them more efficient, right? This way our farms can become a natural place, a place where nature can coexist with us on our land and be a positive force for our production by understanding where's the environment moving towards to, and not trying to eradicate all this and forcing our way through, but by understanding where things are moving and basing our production on that. But before we talk about the layering of enterprises, let's talk about the opposite for 1 second, and that are our common practices. None of our farming practices are connected with other practices. We separated animals from fields and fertility from production. As agricultural landscapes have become more and more uniform, wildlife habitats have been lost, and the dynamics we kill all life from the field by tilling and spraying. We then seed the grain into the field and kill all plants that want to grow there. Succession moving in, right? We're calling them weeds. To be able to have maximum output on our fields. And this works really well. It's very efficient in terms of production, at least as long as we have fertility in our soil, but it has a huge cost. But first of all, it stops the acceleration of fertility in our soils, right? It stops the natural processes that actually build the fertility on the land. All the microbes and insects and organic matter and, everything that kind of builds the fertility on our land goes through certain processes. And by creating this even playing field every year, we're stopping these processes. We're mining the nutrients stored in our soil. And whatever we don't use, we lock up and make unavailable to the plants, right? That's why we need to fertilize more and more every year. Well, secondly, our large-scale monocultures don't allow anything else to live on the land other than the desired crop. Now think about on what large scale we are growing monocultures, and we start to understand the impact modern agriculture has on nature. We are creating deserts where nothing lives other than the one crop we are growing, and we do this every year, all the time. The current system is clearly showing its limits, and this picture, by the way, is in Spain. What you see is acres and acres and acres of plastic, really, greenhouses to produce cheap vegetables for our supermarkets. There are the costs to how the way of enterprises. Let's talk about how we can do things differently, how we can integrate layers of enterprise on our farm. Create win-win-win scenarios where the animals and crops win, the ecosystem or nature wins and has a place, and obviously ourselves as farmers, because this needs functioning. Otherwise, why would we do it, right? Okay, we understand that an ecosystem has different layers to it, different parts, animals, plants, microbes, and so on. Okay, one great way of mimicking these layers on our farms is the integration of birds to existing grass-fed cattle operations, for example, or dairies. Birds are the pasture's cleaning force. They eat a ton of insects, scratching dung piles, eating seeds, fertilizing soil and plants, and a lot more. Thinking about natural patterns, well, the cattle egret, this is the white bird you see here on the picture, is a great example of a symbiotic relationship between layers in an ecosystem, where one element benefits the whole ecosystem without risk to any other of the layers, right? The birds are following the cattle for the insects that emerge through grazing and from the cattle's dung. The birds feed on the insects and they were controlling fly populations for the cattle. The pastures benefit from the extra manure and scratching behavior of the birds, right? Everyone wins. We obviously don't bring the cattle egret to Estonia. We use what we have, and since we are talking about diversifying our farms, we add poultry. Chicken are perfect supplement to any dairy or cattle operation, but this works on any scale, really, on large scale and small scale. Great way to do it is to use mobile chicken coops. With the coops, we are following the cattle on our land. Thereby, we are controlling the impact the chickens have by moving them every other day or so, right? Enough for them to forage for fresh grass and clean up after the cows, dump a lot of chicken manure. We then move the chickens and let the area rest for a few weeks before we then bring the cattle back after everything has regrown, which would then again be followed by the chickens. When we have cows on pasture eating grass, which is the only place a cow should live, and also the only thing a cow should eat, if you ask me, we're going to have lots of flies and insects. But great that the chicken loves to eat the fly larvae before they emerge, right? Which lowers the stress for the cattle, while at the same time balancing the chicken's diets with all the protein and all these other nutrients from the insects. Chickens are herbivores, by the way. They don't just eat plant food; they want to eat animal protein. And all the access the access to herbs and greens and fresh air and sunshine, which the chickens have on pasture. But your customers will appreciate the eggs from a truly free-range chicken. I can tell you that. And instead of expensive fertilizer inputs, we have chicken manure, right? How much money do farmers spend just in the forms of inputs for fertility onto the land? Well, the chicken do this for us, and our only input would be the chicken feed. We have to fix the chicken's food, obviously, but most of it ends up as manure and becomes a problem in the industry. For us, well, the manure becomes valuable fertilizer, which will be taken up by the plants and cycle in your soils through microbiology. This way, we're getting paid to fertilize our pastures with a well-balanced and biological fertilizer. There's no better machine that we could build that could prepare the nutrients in a way that the chicken's body does, right? So with minimal financial effort, we can diversify operations by adding poultry to existing cattle or dairy farms. Pastured eggs are a very profitable business, and it doesn't need a lot of work on a daily basis, work that we could outsource to a new generation of farmers by allowing them to run their own chickens behind our cattle if we don't want to get involved in this. Or we do it ourselves and diversifying not only our income streams, but also our daily work routines, which translates to much better quality of life. And remember, we're doing this because of the benefits the chicken have to pasture, to our land, right? The eggs are the second, but we don't do it for the eggs. We also do it to diversify our income streams, but we mainly do this to kickstart these natural processes and dynamics, which our land will benefit from. And the same works also for broiler production, which we're also doing here on our farm in Estonia. So in order to be more profitable on our land, we don't need to grow in terms of size or land. We need to work smarter and use our land more efficiently, right? We need to work with nature. Well, another way of stacking enterprises is by adding grazing animals into cropping operations. One major pillar of regenerative farming and the fundamental reality of ecology is animal integration. Nature needs animals to function. And I'm happy to argue this with many people out there who claim something else. And the way we integrate animals into cropping operations is, well, it's already a very common practice to have cover crops on your field, and this is getting more and more in Estonia, and I actually see it when I drive around as well. People using mustards and other crops as a cover crop, a catch crop, or there are different ways. Green manures, right? Green manures help to increase soil organic matter, which leads to improvement in soil structure, stability, increased moisture and nutrient holding capacities. There are many benefits why farmers should use green manures. Benefits are enormous, really, but not only as a soil enhancer, we can accelerate the effect and even make money directly with it by letting animals graze it. Here we see, this is a cover crop which was broadcasted into a cash crop. So you see the grain was harvested, and then they broadcasted the cover crop on top of this. And then this can grow into almost maturity, and we then bring animals onto the land and can graze it. This way we reduce our feeding costs. We can utilize land where the cover crop has been grown. We reduce labor and machinery inputs, improve soil health by reducing tillage and increasing biodiversity and increasing fertility as well by bringing in these animals and kickstarting all these processes. While the arable crop being one layer, the cows another, we can have them followed by our chickens to add even more complexity to the land. On top of that, we can bring another important layer, and this might be the most controversial one from a conventional perspective, but that layer of trees in our agricultural lands. And I understand that some of the laws, so to speak, are rather working against this, and I have something to say about this in the end of my talk. But a very important layer on our farms should be trees. Integrating agroforestry lanes, agroforestry being the intentional integration of trees into agriculture, well, on our land gives you not only a tree crop in the future, it will also restore important ecosystem functions. For example, the cycling of nutrients above and below ground we're talking, which will reduce your input costs even more. Your costs will forage for certain trees you have planted, which will balance their own diets and make them healthy and happy. Since they have access to a wide range of edible plants, they can self-medicate and live true to their inherent nature, foraging for different foods like they're supposed to do. The overyielding effect you have created, well, overyielding effect being the sum of your operations producing more combined than each enterprise would in a monoculture, gives you peace of mind and a profit at the end of the year, while it at the same time grows into more and more complexity and fertility, like in an ecosystem. The trees also provide protection from weather for your animals in terms of shade, but also as wind protection for the animals and the crops you grow, which will just help them having less stress and therefore grow better. The benefits of integrating different layers on our farms is just enormous. For your animals, for nature, for your profits, by reducing input costs and by adding more income streams. I hope I could inspire some of you to observe and learn how nature works and how we can build our farming operations based on those observations. How much time does an average farmer spend trying to undo succession? Killing weeds, tilling fields, getting rid of brush, etc. Working with succession, the force that moves nature forward, so to speak, gives us time to make meaningful and impactful decisions on our land. It changes the perspective from managing against something to managing for a desired outcome. It will leave us with more joy about our work, more money in our pockets, and a more healthy and beautiful world for our children to inherit. Agroecology is a new way of conceiving how food is to be produced in the future. It is based on the idea that, well, over the past 50 or 60 years, the tendency in the European Union has been to reward economies of scale, large-scale production, mechanization, and monocultures in the name of increasing production and efficiency. And that has been extremely damaging for the health of the soil, for the preservation of biodiversity, even for the health of consumers, because they were more and more accustomed to consuming heavily processed food, and farmers have become input providers for the agri-food processing. This is a system that is now showing its limits and that must be reformed significantly. Therefore, there's a mismatch between the professed intention of the successive reforms of the common agricultural policy, which is to green it, right, to make it more environmentally sustainable, and the signals that are sent. The economic incentives that are introduced by the system of subsidies that basically reward large-scale producers, and for this reason, I think the agricultural policy is in need of a much more systematic reform that would reward producers, that provide environmental services that support really the development of agro-biodiversity. And with this, I'm finishing my talk. I hope I could maybe get some of you to think a little bit outside the box, and I'm curious to see what how the future of agriculture will change. Well, thank you.
So thank you, Stefan. And we have actually Stefan here with us today. And so there's some questions. So you have settled now here in Estonia. What are your plans next?
Well, I'm actually, thanks for the question. I'm actually managing, together with Alexander, he will also speak later, Olivierile, which is going to be Estonia's first multi-layered regenerative farm. So my wife is from Estonia, so we settle here. No plans to leave.
Ja Stefan ütles, et ta majandab siis praegu hetkel Olivierile koos Aleksandriga, kes meil ka hiljem räägib. Ja tema naine on ka Eestist, nii et tal ei ole plaani siit lahkuda. So, somebody's asking, what do you think should be the first step in Estonia for these kinds of regenerative farms to be like, there would be more of those regenerative farms? Should it be like the subsidies or some more information or support from the scientists, or what do you see?
Well, I would say a mix of all of these things, but the most important thing, in my opinion, is education. That's also one of the reasons why I came here, to actually give courses and build farms to show these kind of things. But then there's another element, and maybe this fits to this talk today as well, is that there are policies in place which actually hinder regenerative agriculture. And I think policymakers should look at this and kind of get the barriers out of the way. For example, you can't put trees in your fields if you want to get subsidies, like, stuff like this.
Ja küsisin siis, et millised peaksid olema Eestis esimesed sammud, et siis taastava põllumajanduse poole liikuda või et selliseid talusid enam tekiks, et kas toetused või pigem teave ja teadlaste tugi või midagi sellist, ja Stefan ütles, et need kõik on olulised, aga siis haridus ja teave on üks kõige olulisemaid, aga kindlasti tuleb üle vaadata ka toetused, et need ei töötaks siis sellele taastavale põllumajandusele vastu, et praegu näiteks ei ole lubatud puid istutada põllumaale. We can talk about it later, there are some possibilities. But you also offer some advice for people. What's your plans? You said you wanted to have this farm that will kind of educate people. How do you see that rolling on?
We're building the farm right now. The plan is that we're going to we take apprentices, so we take people in to learn on the farm. We also do different types of courses, so people come for a week or 2 or 3 days and learn with us. And yeah, this is kind of through the farm. We will also do educational stuff. So we put videos out. We want to work together with universities, with people like Olivier to take what we're doing and put it onto paper and then publish these things. But the main focus will be on actually training a new generation of farmers, really.
Ja küsisin siin, et kuidas ta seda oma teekonda näeb, et hakata teisi koolitama, et teatud, et läbi selle näidistalu, mida nad juba rajavad, ja kindlasti ka läbi koostöö teadlaste, et selliseid neid tulemusi siis avaldada. Do you think that this kind of management that is used in your farm, do you think that after 20 years or so, is this the alternative or is the mainstream way of farming?
I think some elements of what I just said about will be the new mainstream just because of necessity. We don't know how the fertilizer industry will function in the future. We don't know about how the ecosystem will react to all the change we're doing. So there's a big unknown, but I personally believe, otherwise I wouldn't do this work, I believe that some patterns of what we're doing will be the future of agriculture, definitely.
Ja küsisin, et kas 20 aasta pärast selline viljelusviis, mida nendel talus siis tehakse, kuidas majandatakse, et kas see on pigem siis alternatiivne või nii-öelda tavaline või domineeriv. Ja Stefan arvas, et kindlasti osa nendest praktikatest saab nii-öelda tavapraktikaks juba sellest vajadusest, et kuna me ei tea täpselt, kuidas väetise tööstused ja niimoodi jätkavad, et siis kindlasti saab see nii-öelda taastav põllumajandus olema osa tuleviku majandamisest. Okay, so thank you, Stefan. At the moment, we need to move on. I'll give you a little present here. Thank you for coming. And our next speaker will be Olivier de Schaetzen. I hope I pronounced it right. Et Olivier omab siis 2 magistrikraadi ning tausta keskkonnaökonoomikas ja loodusvarade majandamises, arenduses ja ettevõtluses. Ta on taastava põllumajanduse teemadega tegelenud viimased 7 aastat. ja Wageningeni ülikoolis viibides uuris ta ka kogu Eesti põllumajandussektori taastuvale põllumajandusele ülemineku majanduslikku ja keskkonnaalast kasu. Ja sellest ta meile ka täna räägib. Ja praegu teeb ta Amsterdamis koostööd juhtiva jätkusuutlikkuse konsultatsioonifirmaga Metabolic, mis nõustab valitsusi, linnu ja ettevõtteid. Ja kuna tema elukaaslane on ka eestlane, siis on Olivieril Eestiga tihe side ja ta veedab suurema osa ajast siin. Nii et palun.
Hi everyone, my name is Olivier, and in this talk I will explore the economic perspective of regenerative agriculture and how this can overcome the challenges facing Estonian agriculture. Now, my background is in environmental economics, and over the past few years I've been working around the topic of regenerative agriculture to explore how this can help farmers financially, both in Estonia, and now we're also moving to other parts in Europe. Now, let's first see what are some of the challenges that Estonian agriculture is facing. Well, in general, Estonian farms have a low value added per hectare. Now, this means that after subtracting the cost of production from the sales, that there is very little money left. Now, some key figures on this is that the average value added in Estonia is 4 times lower than that of the EU, and that on 1/3 of farmland, the main income is derived from subsidies. Now, this low amount of value added can also be seen in low average crop yields. And as you can see in this table, for many of the crops, the yields are half that of what the potential yields are that have been tested by the Estonian Agricultural Research Center. So to solve this challenge, Estonian farmers have been turning more and more towards intensive agricultural practices. Now, this can also be clearly seen in the data, which shows that there are more and more large farms and less small farms, that there's a strong increase in the use of pesticides of up to 116%, and that there is a dramatic increase in synthetic fertilizer use up to 159%. Now, this move towards more chemically intensive agriculture has actually not resulted in an increased amount of value added. It's actually made the situation worse. This graph shows both the input and output costs, and they show that they have been growing over time. However, it's clear that the input costs, or the cost of production, have been rising slightly more, and which has been leading to lower and lower revenues for farmers and a steady decline in gross value added and thus profit. Now, why is that? Well, the conventional agriculture business model is centered around using synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and tillage. Now, although the system has allowed some farmers to gain higher yields compared to conventional low input systems, these higher yields don't necessarily mean that they also have higher profits. So this graph shows the sales and the costs of farms. Now, as you can see, over the past year, the costs have always been greater than the sales revenue. And it's only been the subsidies, which is the small gray block on top of the sales, that has made farmers marginally profitable in Estonia. Now, by comparison, the regenerative agricultural business model focuses on using that which nature provides for free and turning that into healthy food. Now, I've been so free to take this image from Ben's website. So Ben, I hope you don't mind. But I think that this image really shows the essence of regenerative agriculture. And as you can see, central to regenerative agriculture is the soil. And this is where the 5 principles of soil health come into play that the other presenters have talked about. Now, I won't repeat these principles again, but I do want to go into 2 key mechanisms that underlie them, and that will help us understand the differences between conventional and regenerative agriculture. Now, the first mechanism is a rhizophyty cycle. Now, this is the mechanism that nature uses to provide nutrients to plants for free. Now, a very basic explanation of this mechanism is that there are soil microorganisms in the soil, and they collect nutrients. Then they are attracted by root exudates at the tip of plant roots. And these root exudates contain sugars, which the microbes feed on. Then these microbes enter into the plant roots, and there they release the nutrients. And once this has been done, they exit the roots again, and the whole cycle starts again. Now, this association between plant roots and soil microbiology has three key benefits. The first one is it ensures that plants have access to a broad spectrum of nutrients that support their health. The second is that these carbon-rich exudates that the roots put into the soil really improve the soil structure and provide shelter or housing for the soil microbiology. And the third one is that these microbiology, the beneficial ones, they protect the plant roots by going inside of them and releasing certain substances that make them immune to disease and fungi attacks. Now, the second principle that I want to talk about is a function of insects in nature. So insects are meant to recycle things that are in bad health, that are nutritionally poor, dying, or already dead. So it's this function that also ensures that insects won't and actually even can't attack healthy plants. Now, how is that possible? Well, to be healthy, a plant needs a full nutritional profile, a good balance between water and air, enough sunshine, and this then will lead to high photosynthesis and in turn to high levels of sugar being produced and more complex nutrients being formed inside of the plant. Now, the digestive tract of insects is only designed to digest simple forms of sugars and nutrients. So once they become too complex, insects physically can't digest plants anymore. Now, as a comparison, this would be like us humans trying to eat wood. Our stomachs and our intestines can't digest wood, so we just don't eat it. Now, we can use the sugar content in the leaves of plants as a rough measure of plant health. So as already said, high photosynthesis means a healthy plant and high sugar content. Now, these sugars are usually expressed in Brix. And as you can see, different insects occur at different ranges inside this Brix chart. So moving from relatively simple and to relatively complex, this chart shows where insects can digest certain nutrients and how complex those are. So the aphid group only digests quite simple sugars, moving all the way up to the grasshopper roots, to the grasshopper group, which can digest the most complex nutrients. However, above 12 Brix, there is a kind of a cutoff point. And if plants have Brix readings that are higher than this, they are completely safe from insect attacks and they will no longer have any problems with them. Now, in the next slides, I will compare how conventional agriculture and regenerative agriculture influence these two mechanisms and what that means for their financial performance. Now, let's first have a look at nutrient management. So in conventional agriculture, nutrient management centers around the use of synthetic fertilizers. Now, these fertilizers are either applied in solid or liquid form, but they all share the same characteristic that they can be taken up easily by the plant roots. This has some side effects though. These fertilizers bypass the need of plants to associate with the soil microbes. Now, obviously, this greatly reduces the amount of free nutrients and protection that the plants get from these soil microbes. Now, that then again has a negative impact on plant health, which makes them again more vulnerable to attacks by insect and disease. Another side effect is that this stimulates the breakdown of soil organic matter and carbon by soil microbiology. And this is specifically by applying high amounts of nitrogen to the soil. Now, that then leads to a decrease in water holding capacity, but also adding large amounts of synthetic fertilizers depletes the natural available N in the soil. And as these fertilizers are actually salts, they also change the pH in the soil, which then reduces the amount of soil microbiology. Now, another thing about these fertilizers is that they're actually really not efficient. Now, they only provide nutrients for a very short amount of time, because they can easily be washed away with the rain they can volatilize into the air, or they get immobilized in the soil. And this can also be seen in the low nitrogen use efficiency in Estonia, which sits at about 52 to 59%. So that means that half of the fertilizers that farmers pay for in Estonia just get lost and end up polluting the environment. Now, how does regenerative agriculture deal with nutrients? Well, it's again these 5 principles of soil health that are at the center of it. So I won't go into much detail about them. But these 5 principles ensure that the natural nutrient pump, where plants, roots, and microbes associate with each other, is stimulated maximally. Now, in general, regenerative agriculture does not use any synthetic fertilizers, seeing that they have a negative impact on this natural nutrient pump. But also, overall, regenerative agriculture tries to use as little fertilizers of any kind as possible. Now, there are some practices and products that can be used to speed up the regeneration process of the soil and stimulate the microbiology community. Now, one example of this is adding soil microbiology directly into the soil. And there are either products that farmers can buy for this, but farmers can also brew these microbiology mixtures themselves, so they don't have to pay for it. Now, these are then usually sprayed onto the fields or used as seed treatment, or they can be put directly into the seed furrow and sprayed on top of the seeds when planting them in a no-till seeder. Now, another practice is using cover crops and companion crops. Now, both of these practices increase the diversity of root types in the soil, which then again leads to more biodiversity of soil microbes and more nutrients for plants. Now, cover crops and companion crops can also be selected to reduce specific problems that farmland has, such as soil compaction or the need for more nitrogen fixation or adding more organic matter to the soil. Now, the last principle that can be used is integrating animals back into the system. Now, also the others already talked about this, but by integrating animals, additional nutrients get cycled into on the land, and soil microbiology community also becomes more diverse. So 2 practices to do this is either include a temporary pasture into your crop rotation and have livestock grazing them, or grazing the cover crops that you plant in between 2 cash crops. Now, let's compare the financial performance of this. Now, both conventional regenerative systems usually have around 10 euros per hectare of fixed costs in Estonia. In conventional systems, farmers spend around 132 euros on fertilizers and around 47 euros on seeds. Now, for the regenerative system, let's take a best case and a worst case scenario. Now, as explained before, in the best case scenario, fertilizer use would be 0. No fertilizers would be used. But in the worst case scenario, a cost reduction up to 60% is definitely possible. And this results in either 0 or 52 euros per hectare. Then looking at seeds, regenerative agriculture definitely uses more seeds due to cover crops and companion crops. And the best case scenario, this is an increase in cost about 80%, and in the worst case scenario, 150%, which is respectively then 85 and 118 euros. But as you can see, overall, nutrient management and plant costs for conventional and regenerative agriculture are either significantly cheaper or more or less similar, slightly cheaper for regenerative agriculture. Now let's have a look at pest and weed management. Now again, conventional agriculture uses pesticides to control insects, fungi, and weeds. But the problem that these products have is that they can't isolate the target pests, and instead they end up killing a broad spectrum of insects and soil microbiology. Now, obviously, this again has a negative impact on plant health. But what's sad is that of all the insects in the world, only 1% of them are considered to be pests. So that means that actually 99% of insects are either beneficial or benign. And by using pesticides, we kill off a large part of that 99%. And they can then no longer provide ecosystem services for both plants, but also the natural environment as a whole. Now, another key side effect is tied to using glyphosate-based use herbicides. Now, these products, they act as chelators. This means that they can lock nutrients in the soil, which are then no longer available for the plants. So this means that there are a number of key nutrients that plants can no longer access, which leads to decrease in plant health, and again, making them more disease and insect attacks. So by contrast, regenerative agriculture does not use any pesticides when possible. This is because, explained before, it has such a negative impact on both the above and below ground biodiversity. Now, the main defense used in regenerative agriculture is this association between the plant roots and the soil microbiology, which then secures the plant health. Now, you can see that there is such a large amount of diversity in soil microbes, and these soil microbes are able to secrete a lot of different products and a lot of different substances into the plant roots, which then offer a broad perspective or broad spectrum of protection for the plants. So it's really stimulating the soil microbiology that is key to ensuring plant health and making sure that they no longer attack. Now, another strategy is to really maximize the above ground biodiversity on the farm. Now, this can be done by using flower strips, hedgerows, windbreaks, and cover crops. Now, all of these practices offer a home for these 99% of beneficial insects, which can then help in fighting the pests through natural predation. Another key mechanism is that when soils regenerate, they move along the natural succession path. Generally, our agricultural soils are quite degraded, and this translates into a low fungal to bacteria ratio. Now, as you can see, low fungal and bacteria ratios really favor the growth of weeds. But by regenerating the soil and moving it further along this natural succession path, we can get up to a point where the fungal and bacteria ratio is more balanced with each other. And this is the goal where regenerative agriculture or regenerative farms want to move towards, because at this point, the weeds can no longer grow into the soil because it's not the right environment for them anymore. So by comparison, both conventional and regenerative systems spend around 28 euros per hectare, and this is on additional costs like growth regulators and other products. But in terms of pesticides, conventional farmers in Estonia spend on average 48 euros per hectare. Now, as already mentioned, in the best case scenario, no pesticides are used at all. But in a worst case scenario, reduction can again be around products have to be used in emergency cases. So that results in costs around 0 to 20 euros per hectare. Now, again, in terms of plant protection, it's clear that regenerative agriculture has lower costs compared to conventional agriculture. Then moving on to machine work and operational costs. In conventional agriculture, tillage is the main tool to grow the soil. Now, there are many ideas behind what tillage should achieve. And this can be from cycling nutrients in the soil, burying weeds, loosening the soil so roots can grow better. But the reality is that intensive tillage actually has a lot of detrimental effects. It decreases the amount of soil carbon, nutrients can leach, it really leads to soil compaction. There is a loss of water holding capacity and infiltration rates. And at the same time, it can kill soil microbiology by removing the protection that they get from plant cover. Now, additionally, these fields that have been tilled, they're often left fallow, which means that nothing is growing on there. And during those periods, there is no living root in the soil, which can feed the soil microbiology with the sugar through photosynthesis, which then again has an effect on the amount of soil microbiology in the soil. Now, regenerative agriculture tries to limit soil disturbance as much as possible. Now, this means that tillage is kept to a minimum and that it's only used for crops where tillage is used or tillage is really needed. And this is then usually also not deep inversion tillage, but it's either shallow tillage or strip tillage or other methods that are used to reduce the impact on the soil. Now, instead of tilling, soils can be directly seeded into the plants, either into cover crops or into crop residues. Now, both of these options ensure that there is armor on the soil or soil protection, which then prevents water from washing off the soil and prevents erosion, but most importantly, it also prevents weeds from establishing, and it protects and feeds the soil microbiology. Now, in terms of costs, both conventional and regenerative have around 106 euros per hectare for overhead costs. These are things like electricity, building maintenance, and rent of lands. But in terms of machine work, conventional farmers pay on average 120 euros for the machines themselves, 47 euros per hectare for the maintenance of the machines, and 61 euros for fuels and lubricants. Now, that's about 228 euros per hectare. In terms of the labor associated with this, 50 euros per hectare goes usually to contract work, and 61 euros is for labor costs, for a total of 111 euros. Now, in a region, because the seeds can be planted directly into the soil, the number of field operations can actually be reduced by 50%. Now, in the best case scenario, that leads to a reduction of 30% of the machine costs. And in a worst case scenario, that's only 10%. So that's between 157 to 201 euros per hectare. In terms of the work costs, this leads to a reduction of 30% in the best case scenario, but in the worst case scenario, it actually evens out and there is no difference in machine costs. Now again, when we compare them to each other, regenerative agriculture can either be significantly cheaper or can be more or less the same as conventional agriculture. Now, when we put these costs together, we see that in general, regenerative agriculture significantly lowers the cost of production. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that all of the practices that regenerative agriculture uses build on top of each other. Now, this means that, for example, that by taking care of the soil microbiology, you're at the same time providing nutrients and providing plant protection. Now, it's this interconnectedness between the practices that is one of the key ways in which regenerative agriculture can lower the cost of production. So, to have a complete picture, we also have to look at the yields and the sales revenue. Now, this is a table that I showed you before, which shows the average yields of some key crops under conventional agriculture in Estonia. Now, as you can see, there's still a lot of room for improvement. Now, how can regenerative agriculture actually help that? Or how can it improve these yields? Well, the 5 principles of soil health and their practices have, in general, a positive influence on yield. Now, let's take a baseline, which is advanced crop rotations in organic agriculture. So, in general, this leads to around a decrease of 9% in yields compared to conventional agriculture. So this is really the use of not using chemicals anymore, but also still not using a lot of regenerative practices. Now, when we start layering in more regenerative practices, such as really increasing the biodiversity, then we can see that yield increases start happening. So by moving away from monocultures and increasing the biodiversity, the increase of yields can range between 0 to 35% per hectare. Now, this is mainly because using cover crops or undersowing, which are companion crops for plants, or using things like strip cropping, increase the biodiversity on the farm, which then increases the biodiversity below the soil, but also the biodiversity above the soil, which is then leading to more protection for plants. And it's this combination together that has a potential to really reduce costs, but also increase yields. Now, another way of increasing biodiversity is by planting different varieties of the same species. Now, these cultivar mixtures prevent certain diseases from being able to spread really easily in the field. And depending on the number of varieties that you include into a mix, the benefits of the yield can be 2 to 9%. So the higher the varieties are, or the more varieties you have in a mix, the higher the yield benefits will be. Now, another way of increasing biodiversity is using flowering strips. Now, these can either be used next to the fields, or they have even a better effect when they are used in the middle of the fields. So then you have different rows that you use within your fields. Now, when you implement these kind of strips, you can implement them up to 8% of your field without having any yield loss at the field level. And again, this stimulates soil life, this stimulates the natural biodiversity, reduces cost, and then increases the amount of nutrients for plants. Now, another practice is using windbreaks. Now, I think the picture on the right is something that most people in Estonia have already seen. Wind can actually have a really bad effect on yields. But by planting windbreaks, you can protect the crops from wind damage. And it's not only this protection from really extreme winds that can increase yields, it's also just the effect by making sure that the plant in general is less exposed to the wind, which makes that the plant doesn't put as much energy into the production of a really strong stem and can put more energy into the production of their seeds. Now, in general, this leads to an increase of about 9 to 27%, and that obviously changes based on specific crops. But overall, a positive yield increase can be seen. Now, we also talked about coating seeds or inoculating the seeds and putting soil microbes directly into the soil. Now, these practices help stimulate the association between soil microbiology and the plant roots. Now, this is something you can see clearly in the picture on the left, where you see a very small shoot, but already the shoot has a lot of roots, and these roots are all coated in soil, which are actually soil aggregates which contain soil microbiology. Now, these practices can increase yields by 6 to 28%. And it's really this early establishment and stimulating soil microbiology that then increases plant health and increases the yield. So summing this up, we can see that in general, there is potential for either a slight yield increase or really a very high yield increase. Now, it's important to note that this large yield increase is more likely to be possible on average yield farms. Like as we said before, or as I showed before, on average, the yields in Estonia are quite low compared to their potential. So if you have a farm that's already really high in yields, then there is still a possibility for a slight yield increase, but a yield increase of more than 90% is less likely. But by contrast, when you have a small, there is definitely room for a huge yield increase that can be achieved through regenerative agriculture. So let's compare this. What does this mean in terms of financial? So conventional agriculture in general has around 657 euros per hectare of revenue from crops. And with regenerative agriculture, with the increase of between 8 to 90%, this is around 700 to 1,230 euros per hectare, which is quite a big increase. Now, to have a full overview, we need to put those costs together. So when looking at the revenue and costs of conventional agriculture, it's clear that, as already said before, it's not really profitable. Overall, on average, the revenue is lower than the costs of production, which means that farmers are losing money. Now, with regenerative agriculture, if you look at the worst case scenario, farms will already move towards profitability. The profitability might not be that big compared to the full potential of regenerative agriculture that you can see, but still it moves farms away from being unprofitable to being profitable already. Now, in the best case scenario, obviously, the profitability under regenerative agriculture increases really significantly. Now, as a conclusion, we can say that farms who already have a high input intensity and relatively high yields can either achieve similar yields, but their production costs will decrease significantly, and this in turn will lead to much higher profits. Now, for farms which have a low input intensity and relatively low yields, they definitely can achieve much higher yields, but seeing that they have a low input intensity, their cost structure might remain similar. But in the end, the result is the same, and the profits of the farm will definitely increase. Now, transitioning to regenerative agriculture is not without its challenges. Now, there's a lot of knowledge that conventional farming has built that needs to be unlearned by farmers, and farmers need to really be open to rethink the way of farming. So this means that there is a need for a type of knowledge transfer and a mindset shift about how farming works. Now, on top of this, there are also some cultural challenges. Now, a lot of farmers are facing some social pressure when they're trying alternative farming practices, and this can really prevent their adoption and prevent farmers from moving towards the benefits that regenerative agriculture offers. Now, as we can see, or as we already showed in this presentation, farmers in Estonia are already struggling financially. So asking them to transition might have some financial implications for them. Now, this means that there is definitely need for affordable access to finance. So in general, regenerative agriculture can definitely increase the profitability, but to access that profitability, farms who are already struggling financially could use a push in the back. Now, it's not all bad news, definitely, because regenerative agriculture has a really growing market. Now, many brands are actively promoting regenerative agriculture and are setting up programs to support farmers in their transition. Now, you can see some of the logos, and these are quite large brands. And day by day, the market potential for regenerative agriculture is really growing at a rapid rate, and there's more and more support for farmers to overcome these challenges that I mentioned before. Now, at the same time, regenerative agriculture also offers income-generating opportunities. Now, because regenerative agriculture sequesters carbon in the soil and it restores the health of farmland, farmers can access things like carbon credits, ecosystem service payments, or there are even some additional subsidies available. Now, another strategy that farmers use to increase their profit is selling directly to the people in their community. Now, in this way, they can get a better price for their products and they can provide healthy foods for their community. Now, the key message that I want you to take away from this talk is that in conventional agriculture, you're paying to use, or you're paying for inputs that will end up destroying the soil health and create unhealthy plants, which then leads farmers to use more fertilizers and pesticides to compensate for the loss. And in the long run, creates a downward spiral of decreasing farm health, increasing costs, decreasing profits, which really has no long-term future. Now, by contrast, regenerative agriculture tries to move that spiral around. And by using the things that nature provides for free and working together with nature, regenerative agriculture can create healthy food and an upward spiral where the farm health increases, and this then decreases costs, increases yields, and increases profits. And this can be long into the future, whereas conventional agriculture is really nearing its limits. Now, this is the end for the presentation. Thanks for listening. And I'm looking forward to any questions.
Ja, aitäh, Olivier. Thank you, Olivier. So Olivier on ka meiega siin, et saame temalt kohe otse küsimusi küsida. So maybe the first question I would start, in this presentation you were talking about bricks. So can you explain a bit more what is bricks and how can farmers use it and how can they measure it and so?
Yeah, so bricks is a measure of the sugar content in the leaves or in the plant. Farmers can use handheld tools like a refractometer, which measures that bricks level, the sugar level in those plants. That's usually done by taking plant leaves, crushing them so the plant sap comes out of them, and then using this handheld bricks reader to read the number of bricks, which then gives an indication of how healthy the plant is or how much sugar is being produced. There's some important things there. It needs to be done consistently. Best is to do it in the morning, seeing that then the plant hasn't been able to do as much photosynthesis and the sugar levels will be a bit lower. But in general, yeah, it's a quite easy, low access or low threshold way for farmers to access some information about plant health.
Yes, thank you. Et küsisin siis, et mis asi see BRICS on ja kuidas põllumehed seda ise saaksid kasutada ja mõõta. Ja Olivier ütles, et BRICS mõõdab siis suhkrute sisaldust taimelehes ja selleks kasutatakse sellist mõõteriista nagu refraktomeeter. Ja seda on lihtne kasutada, et on vaja ainult taimelehte see nii-öelda puruks pressida ja siis saab selle mõõtmise ära teha. Ja siis see näitab, kui terve see taim on ja kui palju seal suhkruid on. Seal on mõningad nii-öelda tähelepanu tuleb pöörata mõningatele nüanssidele, et tuleb võtta seda näitu siis iga päev ühel ja samal ajal. Okay, so there is a question. Where is the question? So Evelyn is asking a question about sales. I have understood that the profit also depends on the international market, who defines the price and is closely related to crop yield in that certain year. When you calculated the differences between costs and sales, did you take into account the conditions in the market? How does it affect the farmers?
Yeah, definitely. So crop prices will indeed vary based on certain things. Right now you can see that, for example, fertilizer prices have risen significantly, which then most likely is also going to influence crop prices. But the main key here with regenerative agriculture is that although farmers have options such as direct marketing or other tools to have more control over their price, even if they don't control their price, the production cost can be lowered significantly, and this in turn then leads to higher profits. So instead of being very focused on yields and producing as much as possible, it's about looking at the overall farm profitability and balancing your input costs with your output, right? If I'm significantly decreasing my production costs and can keep my yield levels stable, or even if they would be slightly lower, then I'm still earning more money. My profits would still be the same, irrespective of the market price.
Yes, thank you. Et küsimus oli siis selle kohta, et kui nii-öelda, et millised numbrid ta seal vaatas, et tihti ju teravilja hinnad ja kõik sõltuvad nii-öelda maailmaturu hinnast. Ja Olivier vastas, et jah, et muidugi on erinevaid nii-öelda turumõjutusi, mis seda hinda mõjutavad, ka väetiste kallinemine kindlasti mõjutab turuhinda. Aga et oluline on siin just vaadata seda, et kuidas seda tulu ja kulu siis nagu koos vaadata, et kuidas kulu vähendada ja tulu suurendada. Sama saagi juures on võimalik siis nii-öelda saada suuremat tulu ja kindlasti ka võib-olla proovida uusi või teisi selliseid müügikanaleid, et mitte ainult otse kuhugi turule müüa, vaid otse tarbijatele. So we have another question. Where did the financial numbers came from that were shown? Are they based on scientific research Also, organic yields being only 9% lower than conventional. Where does this data origin from?
So the data on the organic versus conventional yields, this is the latest peer review of all, like a meta-analysis of all the peer-reviewed articles on this, which showed that the previous number of a 20% decrease is actually not true, and it's more around 9%. This is with the complex crop rotation, so really integrating already some crop rotations that are more advanced, which I use as a baseline for this calculation because this is something you would do in regenerative agriculture as well. The financial data comes from the Estonian Agricultural Research Center, from their FADEN database. So this is an EU-wide project. Every country collects this data. And I use the average costs there, or the average cost structure and yields that come from that, as well as the revenue costs. So they are, average Estonian results.
Thank you. Küsimus oli siis, et kust need finantsilised numbrid tulid, et mahepõllumajandus ainult 9% madalama saagikusega kui tavapõllumajandus, et kust see pärineb. Ja Olivier vastas, et on olemas viimane uuring, et võib-olla saame sellele ka hiljem viidata, kus on siis on tehtud just katseid või on näidatud, et kui mahepõllumajanduses rakendada sellist edasiarendatud külvikorda, siis on võimalik selliseid saake saada. Ja samuti need ülejäänud andmed on pärinevad siis FADEN andmebaasist ja põllumajandusuuringute keskusest. So there's another question about how to move towards perennial plant selection, taking also into consideration the climate change.
All right, yeah. So to explain this a bit, I think the question wants to think ahead in the future, and climate change is happening, and climate zones will move, shift more up, so to speak. And when you plant perennials, which are plants which stay, or trees, shrubs, which stay for multiple years, you want to make sure that you accommodate those also in your future climate scenario. But this is really tricky, to be honest. So you won't be able to predict exactly how the climate will change. I think one good way to go about this is plant a lot of diversity and see what will survive. In this point, it's probably the best method to go about this. Seeing it's really difficult to predict. So plant a lot of diverse perennials and see which do the best in your specific context.
Thank you. Et küsimus oli siis, et kuidas liikuda või kuidas valida püsikuid tuleviku jaoks. Ja Olivier vastas, et kuna kliima liigub üha ülespoole, ehk siis kliimamuutuste tagajärjel võib eeldada või arvata, et Eestis läheb soojemaks, et siis võiks seda püsikuid istutades arvesse võtta. Ja istutada siis, seda on tegelikult väga raske teha, aga mida saab teha, on istutada palju erinevaid ja mitmekesiseid püsikuid ja siis vaadata, et millistel läheb kõige paremini. Okay, thank you, Olivier.
You're welcome.
And a little present for you. Thank you. And now we also have Ben again on the line, and all of the people, panelists here. So maybe I would like to ask you all the question. So if people now want to start their regenerative journey, where can they start? What should they read? What should they study? Can you recommend some podcasts, some books, or anything, where to get some more information? Yeah, Ben, maybe let's start with you.
With me?
Yes.
Sorry. So some of the on my website, in actual fact, I have a fairly comprehensive book review, which you can actually order in terms of what I consider the most important ones. So that might be well worth having a look. There's over 700 books on regenerative agriculture that have been reviewed, and you can search for them via even audiobook. You can search for them through interest, difficulty, easy to understand. So that would be my first port of call to start there, and grab some books from that sort of thing. I'm rather hoping to come over to Estonia at some stage and actually do some workshops, digging some soil pits, explaining the first steps, the tentative first steps. But I guess for me, the most important thing is to take things slowly. Most farmers are in a huge rush when they decide to take the leap for sustainability, and often end up with problems. It's a very slow process to wean yourselves off chemical and physical junky soils into a more biological, sustainable soil that will provide an awful lot for you in the future.
Ja küsisin siis, et kust inimesed võiksid alustada, et mis ta soovitab, mis raamatuid, mida uurida. Ja Ben ütles, et tema kodulehel on olemas nii-öelda lugemisnimekiri raamatutest, kust saab siis otsida kas huvi järgi või raskusastme järgi erinevaid raamatuid siis taastava põllumajanduse kohta. Ja Ben loodab ühtlasi ka tulla siis Eestisse varsti töötubasid tegema ja paneb eelkõige, ütles, et seda teekonda tuleb alustada aeglaselt ja võtta rahulikult protsess nii-öelda keemiliselt põllumajanduselt bioloogilisele üleminekul on pigem aeglane protsess. So the same question for Olivier.
Right. I think you mentioned podcasts, for example.
Yeah.
I would say there is a good YouTube channel and podcast centered around John Kempf, John Kempf's podcast, and the YouTube channel of Advancing Eco-Agriculture. Probably has some good agronomic insights that farmers can look at. Books probably covered by Ben's website. I think that's quite extensive. In terms of research, there is different institutes that people can look at. So the Rodale Institute in the United States, the Croatan Institute are both good sources to look at. And apart from that, there's quite some peer-reviewed literature, but I wouldn't say it's really condensed in one spot, so it's a bit difficult to access those. But starting with these, I would say those are a good addition to what Ben already mentioned.
Thank you. Ja Olivier ütles siis, et tema soovitaks selliseid YouTube'i kanaleid või ka podcaste, mida veab John Kempf, Advancing Eco-Agriculture nii-öelda ettevõtte raames, et seal on tal tõesti palju erinevaid jutuajamisi, millelt on palju õppida. Ja kui vaadata teaduse poole, et siis on olemas ka mingid teadusartikleid, aga need ei ole otseselt kuhugi ühte kohta koondatud. Ja kindlasti Ameerikas on ka Rodale Institute, mida võib nagu lähemalt uurida. Okay, so Stefan.
I would also recommend Ben's homepage for sure as a start, but then I would also say try to connect with farmers who are on their journey already. On social media, there are many groups who discuss these topics. There's even a group in Estonia we just started. It's called Regenerative Agriculture in Estonia. If you want to just join it and start a conversation with us, and then this is what I would say: like find people who are already on this path and learn with them and from them.
Okay. So I think we have run out of time for this. So. Thank you all. Thank you, Ben and Stefan and Olivier. Et aitäh kõigile. Vabandust, ma unustasin Stefani tõlkida. Et on olemas Facebookis loodud selline Facebooki grupp Regenerative Agriculture Estonia, kus siis saab infot vahetada ja arutada just Eestiga seotud teemasid. Ja kindlasti ta soovitab ka Benni kodulehte vaadata. Nii, aga edasi on meil siis kavas väike lõunapaus. ja ootame teid kõiki tagasi siis kella 1, kui jätkame. Head isu!